There's been a great deal of time and effort and money expended on creating a guitar that plays perfectly in tune all the way along the length of its neck. So you might think of a system like the buzz facing system, where the nut of the guitar is minutely adjusted to increase or decrease the string length to help it play in tune. Other luthiers might intonate the saddles of the guitar, and some other luthiers have very, very ingeniously reshaped the frets of the guitar so that the string plays in tune at all points. Now, while this is a very commendable thing to do, I mean, obviously it's really important to have a guitar that tunes consistently. Nevertheless, there are one or two issues about this that are worth thinking about. The first thing is that in a way, to get a guitar that is in tune perfectly is actually impossible because of the nature of the instrument itself. So things like fret height, or the amount of fret wear, the amount of string wear, the amount of wear on the nut or the saddle, top distortion on acoustic and classical guitars, where the bridge might tip forward or back depending on the shape of the top, the amount of finger pressure an individual guitarist might use. All these things mean that the guitar is inevitably going to not quite be in tune. Another issue is the fact that when we talk about intonation on the guitar, we're really referring to what's called 12-tone equal temperament. And this is something that developed historically from Pythagorean tuning, through mean tone, well temperament, through to our own equal temperament now. But in a sense, equal temperament is not in tune. And this is a thing put very, very well by W.A. Matthew in his wonderful book, Harmonic Experience. In this, he says, in 12-tone equal temperament, only the octaves are in tune and the unisons, nothing else. The perfect fifths are 2 cents flat from the 3-2 ratio that they theoretically should be. And the major thirds are 14 cents sharp from the 5-4 ratio. So what this means is that throughout the centuries, musicians have found ways to alter the pitch of the guitar whilst they're actually playing. And the most obvious example of this is through vibrato. So you might want to use vibrato for 2 reasons. The first reason might be for expressive purposes, and the second reason might be to minutely adjust the pitch of a string so that it sounds beautifully in tune when you hit that particular note. So the way this works is that if you took the string towards the saddles, it slackens the string slightly and the string drops in pitch. And if you pull the string back along the length of the neck towards the nut, then that has the effect of tightening the string and minutely sharpens the string. The other form of vibrato, where you pull the string towards the floor or push it up towards the ceiling, that sharpens the string, but it won't quite flatten it in the same way. Now, there are other techniques, obviously, for manipulating the pitch while you're playing. So another obvious example is the tremolo arm on electric guitars, used by people like, Jeff Beck and people like that use that beautifully. Other guitarists like Rykuda or Derek Trucks use bottleneck. But on all these occasions, the guitar isn't being played perfectly in tune in the sense that we mean is in sort of perfect equal temperament. Other guitarists, as a good example of Pierre Bensusan, for example, Bill Frisell, Pierre Bensusan's acoustic guitarist, Bill Frisell, and Jimi Hendrix as well, who were manipulating the pitch by pushing the neck forward or pushing it forward to flatten it a pitch or pulling it backwards to sharpen the pitch. There's a famous example of when Jimi Hendrix came off stage at one of the big festivals and handed the guitar to his roadie, and the neck was actually loose after he'd finished playing it. Examples of guitarists actually altering the tuning of the guitar slightly as well. So Paul Davids, in a wonderful video, talks about the guitarist John Frusciante from the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And on one of his pieces, he tunes his B string, I think, slightly flat, so as to make it sound perfectly in tune when he's playing a G chord. And a more extreme example is possibly the Velvet Underground, who actually deliberately tune their guitars slightly sharp of each other as a way of creating a more slightly edgy sound on some of their recordings. Now, when we start talking about altering the pitch like this, what we're beginning to touch on is this larger question of temperament. And obviously, in other types of music, Indian classical music and Arabic music and music from Iran and other countries like this, they use different temperaments to the temperaments that we use in Western music. But we can see within our own music that there is an acceptable degree of fluctuation of pitch, which is used for expressive purposes. Another good example of this is actually is the singer Adele on her latest album, where she very, very deliberately manipulates the pitch, I think very, very expressively. But my point, and I think this is an important point, is that temperament is a culturally driven thing. There's a tendency, particularly when you read books and articles about temperament, to be led to the conclusion that temperament is somehow mathematically derived, that over the hundreds of years the efforts of mathematicians and musicians and physicists to arrive at a perfect musical temperament, it turns it into a sort of like a mathematical or a scientific endeavour. And whilst maths undoubtedly plays a part in all of this, I would suggest that it's actually culturally driven. And I think there's some very, very compelling evidence to support this idea. I recently read a book called Inside Arabic Music, and I'd like just to read a passage from that book to just illustrate this a little bit. So the point's made here: a good way of tracking the shift in what constitutes correct intonation is to compare different deliveries by the same singer over a 30-year period. Examining recordings in Maqam Hijaz by Egyptian diva Kulthum, considered a principal authority on correct intonation, from the 1930s to the 1960s, reveals a gradual shift in the size of the nominal 1.5 tone interval between the second and third degrees in Maqam Hijaz. As was the fashion back then, that interval was noticeably smaller in the 1930s than it was in the 1960s and 70s, when the introduction of Western notation and instruments influenced Arabic musical intonation and shifted it closer to equal temperament intonation. In keeping with the changing fashion, Kulthum adjusted her delivery of Maqam Hijaz over the years to follow the contemporary consensus. That difference gives 1930s recordings in Maqam Hijaz a very dated feeling. For this reason, any absolute pitch measurement would only be accurate for a given historical period, losing its accuracy with the passing of the decades. In conclusion, it's worth bearing in mind that it's not enough for us as guitarists just to think, well, I've paid a lot of money to have my guitar perfectly set up, therefore I could expect it to play in tune. What it really takes is for one to continually adjust the intonation of the guitar as you're actually playing. And to be able to do that in a spontaneous way in the moment, it's absolutely essential that we listen to ourselves as we actually play.